Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. I'm Rajuna, and today I've got a special guest on, an old friend called Jonathan Lyonhart. We went to high school together and summer camp, and he's how I came in contact with Seth Hart, who's been on the channel many times. So thanks for coming on, John.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Excited to be here. So it's been a long time.
It has been a long time, yeah. It's fun. I never expected you to get into theology to such a high degree.
Well, I think when last time I saw you, I was 17. And
yeah.
I think I didn't actually have my major shift towards like taking religion seriously until a few months after that summer, which is the last time we would have seen each other. When did you go in that direction?
Well, I met the Harry
point.
Christians in 2011.
So yeah, we both neither of us were on this direction when we met, and then we kind of just went totally in another. We just entered whole other universes after that.
Oh yeah, why don't you give a quick background on your academic career?
Yeah, so I did my first master's at Regent College in Vancouver while I was doing ministry there, and then I went and did a second master's in philosophy of religion at the University of Cambridge, where I also did my PhD. My PhD was also at Cambridge, and now I am a assistant professor of theology and philosophy at Lincoln Christian University, and I'm also a fellow at the Cambridge Center for the Study of Platonism. So yeah, that's me. So, and I'm also here to kind of self-promote my new book as well, which is MonoThreeism, an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub. So here's the self-promotion pitch. But yeah, that's kind of what I'm doing now. I'm teaching and trying to write, and yeah.
Yeah, so we're going to be discussing the topic of that book, which is a defense of the logical coherence, or an explanation why the Trinity doesn't need to be logically coherent. I don't know which one of those you want to go with.
I think that's a very good summary. Yeah. A defense of why it doesn't need to make sense.
Right.
Would probably. Yeah, I think that's a good way to go with that, the way you said it. So
yeah. So if you find the subject interesting, I do recommend that book. I've given it a read. It's done in quite a fun and humorous way, while also containing quite the academic arguments, and quite thoughtful. It's Steelman's ideas and so on. I remember Jonathan always had a really good sense of humor, and so he's carried that into this book he wrote.
Well, another sales pitch. Here it is.
Sweet.
Available on Amazon. So I've done that so many times now. It's
right.
I'm just all the time.
Have you gone on lots of podcasts?
I mean, not as much as I probably should have, but I've done a few things here and there. So it's been a busy. The book came out right as I was starting my first year of teaching, which is kind of an insane period where you have to come up with courses. So I've just been dying slowly of busyness.
Right. Yeah, it'd probably be easier if you've been teaching the same courses for the last 10 years and had every bit of every course memorized.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
All right. So why don't we get into the... Yeah, so basically today I'm going to listen to his arguments in favor of the Trinity and offer some skepticism and give him a chance to explain his views. I guess we should start by explaining the landscape a little bit. This is the first podcast I've done on the Trinity, so we could just could you give a little bit of a lay of the land of the debates around the Trinity, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, anyone who's familiar with the Trinity is familiar with the basic problem that theologians have been debating for the last 2,000 years, which is, how does 1 + 1 + 1 equal 1? That basic equation of how God can be 3 and 1 and many at the same time, is just sort of this inescapable problem that Christians keep bumping up against over and over again. And we solidified our doctrines of the Trinity in like the 3rd, 4th, 5th century But a lot of people would say those doctrines still don't make that much sense. And theologians have tried to provide answers to that over and over again for, the last 2,000 years. And my sense is that no one's really succeeded in providing some sort of logical, rational explanation of how God can be three, but also one: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, but also just a monotheistic God. And my contention in the book is that we don't necessarily need to be able to explain that in order for it to be rational to believe in. There's lots of things that we believe in with rational justification without necessarily understanding those things. So an example, say 5,000 years ago, before we had a scientific explanation for why it rained, for precipitation and condensation and all of that type of stuff, we didn't have any rational understanding of why it rained or how the rain worked. And nonetheless, we were rationally justified in believing in rain. Why? Because we got wet. And that's kind of what I'm arguing today, is that the Trinity might not make sense, but we still have rational justification to believe in it. And we'll get into that more as we go along. But yeah. So, lay of the land, laid.
Right. So, yeah, and one of the arguments you give in the book was that like what you just mentioned, that there's lots of things we don't have rational explanations for. Oh, like you mentioned about the Big Bang. Perhaps you want to go into that argument now.
Yeah. Should I maybe give an outline of what the argument of the book is?
Sure, yeah. One. Yeah, let's start there.
So basically, I look at the Trinity and, how can God be Father, Son, Spirit, three entities, and yet simultaneously one monotheistic God? And I basically say, well, it doesn't make sense. Rationally, logic breaks down. The law of non-contradiction breaks down when you're looking at this. God's either three or one, not both. And so that seems at least like a contradiction. But then in the next part of the book, what I do is I look at the origins of the universe, how anything came to exist at all. And I look at the different options for explaining that. And I realize that that also breaks down. No one has a logical, rational explanation for how the universe itself came to be. Logic, the law of non-contradiction, seems to break down when we talk about the origins of everything. And then what I point out is that actually, when we look at the origins of the universe and the Trinity, these aren't just two separate contradictions. They actually sound a lot like the same contradiction. The same issues that appear when you're talking about the Trinity reappear in a different dress when you're talking about the origins of the universe. It's actually the same philosophical, theological contradiction in a different disguise. And so what I'm saying is that the Trinity might not make sense, but it actually makes as much sense as our own existence, because the same contradictions that appear when you talk about the Trinity reappear when you try to explain how anything came to be at all. In which case, does that mean that belief in the Christian God becomes as rational as belief in our own existence? That's the basic argument of the book, is that I don't understand the Trinity, but it makes as much sense as the fact that I exist at all here in a state of not understanding. And so, like the rain, they might not have understood how the rain cycle worked, but they nonetheless were justified in believing in it because they got wet. Well, I don't understand how the Trinity works, but am I nonetheless justified in believing it because, well, I exist here. My face is real. I'm touching a table. I'm looking at a universe that is empirically real. So that's kind of the argument of the book, in short. But the deeper question is, how exactly does the Trinity parallel the origins of the universe? And that would take a lot longer to explain. And I'll probably end up explaining it at some point in this conversation. But that's the basic framework. And then I build from there. So.
Oh, it seems like you understand the podcast thing where you don't give a whole lecture, you talk in sound bites. I've learned, like, you have academics on sometimes and they're amazing minds. They've got so much to say, but they're used to having a captive audience and speaking for 2 hours nonstop, rather than the back and forth thing. So you understand the back and forth thing. Obviously, you know how to lecture too.
That's probably what I would have done, but because you just said that, now I'm terrified of doing that. So I'll be very careful and not do that.
No. I was just pointing out how expert you are. Is that a hammer in the back? What do you bust that out if you're ever losing a debate in a podcast?
Yeah, so I actually have an assortment of weaponry. I have a hammer here, and then I have a whip that I actually smuggled back on an airplane from Mexico. I bartered for it with someone in a Mexican marketplace. So I actually have an assortment of weaponry in my office.
Oh, okay, I'll make sure to behave myself.
Yeah.
So when I was listening to the book, because I converted it to audio and listened to it at double speed rather than reading it, which is interesting. I didn't catch that bit that there was an argument that it's the exact same logical paradox going on with the Big Bang as with God. I just thought, oh, here he's arguing that the Big Bang doesn't make sense and we tolerate that. So why not tolerate the Trinity not making sense? And of course, an obvious reply to that is, well, if there's a competing explanation which makes more sense, then you go with that. And obviously there's places where you have to give an explanation which you don't have an explanation for, or where you have to choose between a lot of explanations which all have costs or trade-offs or vices that come along with them. And I would argue that the Hare Krishna conception of God, where we say God is one person but has multiple personalities, is simpler, because we're still saying this one person. We're the way I explain it is to say that what I can do from one across time, God can do simultaneously. So a famous example that Prabhupada gave was a court judge who was someone was waiting to see him for a long time, and the man got tired of waiting one time, and he poked his eye through the keyhole and saw that the man was in there with his son, riding him around the room like a horsey. So this is an example of the same person expressing a different personality across time. The court and the court judge, when he's in the court, is a very different personality from when he's playing with his son, but it's the same person. And God can, the Hare Krishna conception of God, that he also has multiple forms that can exist simultaneously. But this is God displaying various aspects of his personality. But we say this is all the same person, just a very diverse person who can express himself in diverse ways and all do so simultaneously. He can even forget that he's God, just like the court judge. If he's remembering all the stresses of his day and his identity as the court judge, he's probably not present with his son very well. But if he can forget what an important person he is and just be the horsey for his son, he can have a far deeper relationship with his son. And this is a higher, like God's the greatest being imaginable. This is a greater being, as one who can be present deeply in a relationship with us and forget that he's God and just be with us. So I've thrown a lot out there.
I started to formulate a response to stuff, and then you moved on to another interesting idea, and then I was like, oh, formulating response to that. But I think the gist of what you're saying is, if this whole Trinitarian 1 in 3 mumbo jumbo, maybe you can make it work, but it doesn't seem like the simplest, easiest way to go. It seems like a simpler, less complicated Occam's razor type of response is to just say that God is one, and that he has 3 different personalities or ways that he manifests himself. Just like I'm a father, but I'm also a professor, and I'm also a son.
Yeah.
It's a simpler explanation. And I think I have a couple of things to say to that. Historically, some Christians did sort of take that tack when they were early on figuring out theology, where the Father and the Son and the Spirit are just one person with different faces, or just different phases. And like you said, the judge, who's a judge in one context, a father running around with his kid in another. Theologically, Christians, though, in the end realized that that didn't quite fit what they felt the gospel record recorded, because there was a real sense that Jesus and the Father were different, and that there really is a difference. He's having a conversation with another entity, another person here. So the Christian sort of scriptural theological issue with that would be that. But the bigger philosophical problem that I would have is that I don't know if it actually is simpler. Because when you get to questions like how does this entity create the universe, I think you end up having to bring in the diversity that the Trinity is trying to get at. This is really hard to talk about, so I'm trying to articulate it better. I don't think God is one and then manifests as three. I think the oneness is not more fundamental than the threeness. Because in my ontology, I think unity and diversity, oneness and manyness, both are held together in eternal tension. And to say that it's just one God who chooses in time to manifest in three different ways loses that tension by emphasizing oneness over manyness and unity over diversity. But I personally believe that ontology needs to hold those things in tension and not lose either. And so at the heart of my ontology is a God who is one in many, unified in his diversity. And that is monotheism, but it's a complicated nuance of it. And it's though that's where the contradiction comes in. How can God be one and many? Well, he's beyond reason. But I think that becomes important when you try to explain how the universe of manyness came about. How does an eternal being that is totally one create a universe of manyness, of time, of difference, of change, of otherness? And I don't know if you can actually make sense of how a God who is absolutely one can cause manyness. I think the same problem that occurs in the Trinity, oneness and manyness, reoccurs when you try to talk about a one God who spawns the many of the universe around us. So I think the Trinity has complicated questions, but I don't think just appealing to a strict monotheism gets around those questions. It just relocates those questions elsewhere and has to face them in other places, such as when you're talking about the origins of the universe. That was a lot. Was I making any sense there? Or
Yeah, that makes sense. Now it's probably a good time to talk about Achincha Beta Beta Tattva. I'm not sure if I've mentioned this to you, the simultaneous inconceivable oneness and difference, which is a key feature of Chaitanya Vaishnavism.
Okay, let's hear it. Go for it.
So I can give a little bit of a lay of the land for the debates and different views related to this that have gone on in Vaishnava traditions in India. So Shankara, first there was Buddhism. There was Vedas, and then Buddha came along, and he managed to get people to give up the Vedas in large part and take to Buddhism. And then Shankaracharya came along and reintroduced the Vedas, but kept the Buddhism, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So it's basically just an impersonalist philosophy like Buddhism, but the twisted logic was given based on the Vedas to make it fit. And then Madhvacharya and Ramanujacharya came along. Madhvacharya is like, no. So Shankaracharya's philosophy of impersonalism is that everything is zero. No, well, I think one way it's described is everything is. Buddha came and said everything is zero. Shankaracharya came and said everything is one. Madhvacharya came and said everything is two. So, so Shankaracharya is saying we are God. We've just forgotten it, and it's not that we become God. We're already God. We've just forgotten it. So nothing actually changes. But the reason we think we're, individuated piece of consciousness living in a conditioned material reality is because we've fallen under an illusion, and all we have to do is wake up from that illusion and realize that which was always the case, and then we'll stop suffering. And he described this ultimate reality as being devoid of all qualities, so there's nothing you can say about it because any description you give of it will be attributing qualities to it. And then Madhvacharya came along and said, no, actually, I think Ramanujacharya was first, but Ramanujacharya's view was everything's two. It's just like hard dualism. The jiva and the soul are categorically different. Ramanujacharya taught qualified non-difference is the way it's described. So Shankaracharya was Advaita Vedanta, Advaitavad, dualism. Madhvacharya was Dvaita, dualism, and Ramanujacharya was qualified. What's the Sanskrit? Vaishishta Advaita, qualified non-dualism. So I forget the nuances of how qualified non-dualism differs from Achincha Beta Beta Tattva, but there is a difference. It's just the I looked into it a while ago and it sort of made sense, and then it slipped away from me again. But Sri Chaitanya came 500 years ago and taught Achincha Beta Beta Tattva that it's inconceivable, so we can't possibly get our head around it, but we are both one with God and different from God, and both God is one with the world and different from the world. So you're playing with this with the Trinity, and we're playing with this with the world, the soul, and God, and those are the three things. And I think there's a Sanskrit word that any religion needs to explain these three things. I can't remember what the Sanskrit is for it, but that's basically if you have a philosophy in Indian traditions, you got to say explain the world, explain the soul, and explain God, or the ultimate foundation of reality, because there's atheistic versions. And when I was listening to your book, it sounds like you were giving the Trinity as a solution to the problems which we solve with Achincha Beta Beta Tattva, because the oneness and difference. One question is if we're just categorically different from God, then wouldn't my attempt to have a relationship with God be something like an ant trying to have a relationship with a human? The categorical difference means the relationship can't really be there. So in order for a relationship to be possible, there needs to be some difference and some similarity. So the relationship you can have with a pet is greater than what you could have with an ant, because there's some similarity. Dogs and cats, particularly dogs, have an ability to engage with human emotion, but not nearly as much as you could with another human being. And this is why we don't marry pets, we marry humans.
Yeah.
So
well, and I think sorry.
Yeah, you go.
Well, my exposure to Eastern thought has really come in the last 2 or 3 years. And so anything I'll say here is probably inadequate and ignorant. But I would say I have loved what I've been interacting with so far in my readings, because there's just such a focus on ontology in the Eastern context. Like the different schools are almost based around their differences on these ontological questions, which I find fascinating. But I think you're really right that a lot of the things we've been talking about with the Trinity are reoccurring, and you're finding solutions and interesting thoughts about it in more Eastern context. And I think there's some really interesting parallels there. And I think you're right that there needs to be unity with God amidst the difference. So if there is this categorical qualitative distinction between creator and creature, then where's the bridge by which we can have a relationship with him? And for me, that's precisely the beauty of the Trinity. God is unity in diversity. He's one and different with himself. And it's because that oneness and that difference is grounded ontologically in the one who is being itself, that the rest of reality also reflects that oneness and manyness, such that we are unified with God and different from him, just as the Son is unified with the Father but different from him, and the Spirit is unified with the Son and Father but different from them. So I feel like in many ways we're talking about the same questions in different language, and I do think that everyone ends up having to throw their hands up at some point and saying it's a mystery. It transcends language, it transcends logic. The question is, where do you locate that mystery? And I personally locate that mystery within God himself, in the Trinitarian mystery. And then once I've made sense of that, I feel like I can make quite clear sense of how God relates to creation. But my sense is you're locating the mystery more in how God relates to creation, not within God himself, because you don't have the Trinity within God himself. Does that make sense? Or am I kind of just going all over the place there?
Yeah, that makes sense. There was a thought that I had, but I lost it when I was following the rest of what you said.
Yeah.
What was it? Great thing about recording it is you can edit these bits out easily.
Well, that's not fair. If I say something good, you could just edit it out, and you could make yourself.
Yeah, I'll take all my pauses out so it sounds like I'm just really sharp and speak really quickly, and I'll leave all your pauses in.
There we go. So, well, I think we all sound like idiots when we're trying to talk about like these types of questions. So,
oh yeah, you articulated it well. That everyone's going to have a mystery somewhere in their ontology, and the question is, where do you locate that mystery? That really hits the nail on the head. And so this is one argument we give against Advaita Vedanta, because when you want to say that the ultimate reality is attributeless, then how do you explain the world? Now you have no explanation for the world. And that's the wrong place to put the mystery. The right place to put the mystery is in God, not in the world. Whereas when you have the correct explanation, when you have a view of God, like we do the opposite. Instead of saying God has no qualities, we say God has all the qualities. And of course, then the question is, well, does that mean God has all these evil qualities too? And then we reply to that by saying that the bad things of this world are caused by it being a perverted reflection. So something that has good qualities, you can have a reflection of that, which has bad qualities, which the source of the reflection itself does not have. So we're kind of getting off topic here, but it's an interesting interfaith discussion.
Is that similar to sort of an Augustine's privation theory of sin and evil, or?
Well, we understand sin to be a product of ignorance. I think there's this Christian idea that sin is due to an evil nature. There's something intrinsically bad about a person who sins, whereas we understand a person who sins is just acting out of ignorance, whereas their soul is ontologically good at the bottom. They've just come in contact with some good qualities and are lacking contact with the knowledge required to act properly. But a common analogy given for this is the sun reflected on the water. So you can destroy the reflection by throwing pebbles in the pond, but you can't destroy the sun. So good qualities emanate from God, but then in this material world, there's perverted reflections of them and they become bad. Like there's original, pure, supreme, loving conjugal relationships, but then in this world, we see so much horrific things going on in conjugal relationships.
It's interesting because I know the type of Christian view that you're talking about there, but I think where you were just referring to actually shows the commonality in our positions, because Augustine's privation theory is precisely that sin doesn't have any purchase on our ontology or on nature. For him, sin doesn't really exist. It's the absence of goodness and being. It's like, does darkness exist? No, it's just the absence of light. And so, I mean, for the Christian, sin does not pervert being itself. It's the absence of God's goodness and being. And I don't know if it's, I know that original sin often gets talked about in a way that makes it sound genetic, like we've inherited it biologically. But I think the correct place to locate sin is not in our very nature, because God created the world and called it good in Genesis. So the nature of things is supposed to be good. It's rather located in our free will. Evil is supposed to be located in our choice to do evil, and to fracture the goodness of creation. So I'm trying to juggle multiple things here. And so I think at some level, even those who believe in original sin have to maintain that the entity itself is still fundamentally good because God created it and called it good in Genesis, but that somehow the will has been tainted. And the will's that part that God didn't create, but where we get to self-create, right? Because we get to freely choose what to do with our lives. And I think that's a big difference, perhaps. That's where the real difference lies there is, and this is true also of Christians and Greek thought, is the Greeks tend to see error and mistakes and sin as ignorance. If you knew more, you would do better. Whereas I think my account would just say, well, I think a fully conscious, rational individual can just still choose to do the wrong thing because they want to do it. And so I don't know if I would locate sin in our nature because I have a privation theory of sin, but I would locate it in the will, if that makes sense. Did all of that come together, or did I get too lost in what I was trying to build there?
No, yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, so I think our tradition would attribute some ontology to ignorance. There's the Sanskrit word vidya and avidya. Avidya means the absence of knowledge, I guess, but it's described as a thing. There's ignorance, and there's an explanation given that like Prabhupada explained that the path of Krishna consciousness. So we're trying to develop God consciousness, and develop pure love of God, and the tracks that we're moving on, there's two tracks. One of them is understanding that this world is suffering. Another one is understanding of the beauty of the spiritual world. So we've got to understand the nature of this world and understand the nature of the spiritual world in order to be motivated correctly. Maybe that's slightly unrelated, but this idea of avidya, that there's bad association or bad ideas that you can be covered over by. That there's an actual thing that called ignorance, which you can succumb to, and then you're pulled out of it by coming in contact with vidya, with real knowledge, and ultimately getting realized understanding of that knowledge. That there's a distinction between knowing something and then having realized knowledge of that thing too. I think we're ranging quite a lot of subjects here.
Well, I mean, our listeners might have no idea what the hell's going on. But
oh, just a quick question: are you a classical theist?
So if you were reading my book, you might have gotten the sense that you didn't quite know where to place me. My defense in monotheism, another plug, I think is actually potentially unique. I'm still looking around to see if anyone else has said what I've said specifically, but I haven't actually found anyone saying what I'm saying. And precisely because I'm trying to believe in a contradiction, I can say things like, yes, I'm a classical theist, but also I believe God relates to the universe in a very relational way, such that classical theists would sneer at me. And it's precisely the contradiction that I'm trying to maintain that allows me to kind of take the good stuff of classical theists, but also bring in some of the good stuff of not being a classical theist. And so that's the complex answer to that question. But you might have seen that in the book itself. Like, I maintain that God is being in a very classical theist kind of way, but he's also related to becoming in Jesus, the incarnation, time. And so I kind of just hold that intention. So.
Right, yeah, you were using some of the classical theistic language. A way to get to the bottom of this might be to ask your thoughts on Ryan Mullins's critiques of classical theism.
So I've seen that you're having him on the show. I actually have a book that is being considered by Ryan's.
Is it being or becoming?
Huh?
Is it being or becoming?
Is what?
Is your book being or becoming?
Oh, it's both. It's in a state of being, having become. No, so I have a book under consideration by Mullins. He's putting together a series on classical theism, kind of redone, with Whiffenstock, which is a publisher, and I have a book with him that I think's on the final stages of being considered for publication. He might reject it, and then I'll sound like an idiot having said this publicly.
As Ryan Mullins the guy that gets to do the rejecting?
He's already approved it, so he likes it. So I think him and I are quite similar in some ways, but again, the complicated part of my book is that I'm kind of taking a both and approach, where classical theism is true, but it's also not true. And so I would agree with Mullins, but also disagree. And that's the contradiction, is that I'm kind of saying both at the same time.
Is that like trivialism?
So, in what sense?
a classical theism is both true and not true? You mean it's got good bits and bad bits, not that it's logically contradictorily true and not true?
Well, I mean, the argument of my book is that God is centrally. I don't say that God is a contradiction. Rather, I say that
Paradox.
we can still believe in him even though he seems like a contradiction. So I would say it seems like classical theism is true, but it also seems like there are parts of it that aren't true. And I hold that in tension because I believe God is eternal, absolute, transcendent, unchanging, all of those things. That's the way that most of us describe God the Father in Christianity. But I also believe that in some way, in some Trinitarian mystery, he's also the Son who incarnates here and now on earth, who grows up, who is birthed from a mortal womb and can suffer and physically die, which isn't, I mean, classical theists say they believe in that, but I find it very hard for them to reconcile that with classical theism in any sort of reasonable way. And for me, that's precisely the mystery of the Trinity. God is somehow this eternal, absolute, distance, transcendent, immutable Father, and also this temporal, suffering, dying, fleshly Christ. And how do those come together? Well, that's the mystery of the Trinity. So I believe a lot of things that the classical theists say, but I also, yeah, I don't know how else to say it.
Right.
But again, the reason I don't I think at this point, when we appeal to mystery, a lot of people just say, okay, so it's a mystery and I don't understand. And the problem with that is you could end up believing anything, however irrational it is. And that's the unique move I make in my book, is that, yes, I don't understand it, but I try to rationally justify believing in it by tethering it to the origins of the universe. Yes, I do not understand how it makes sense, but I have the same problems when I look at the origins of the universe, so it makes as much sense as our own existence. And so I'm trying to rationally justify believing in something that's irrational, whereas I think a lot of people just sort of say, "Oh, I don't understand it. I'm just going to have faith." And I'm not actually making that move. I'm trying to do something more sophisticated than that. Anyways,
Yeah, so I think we've had a nice little interface, and we can get back to your arguments in the book. So there's I lost my train of thought again. So yeah, in the book, it seems like you were saying, or just now you were explaining your argument. It seems like the argument might be not that, well, there's other things we believe that are also logically incoherent. Look at this one. But your argument might be that these other things that we believe which are logically incoherent, such as the Big Bang, are actually another iteration of the exact same features of reality that the Trinity exposes us to.
I think that's a helpful distinction that you're pointing out, because there's obviously things that don't make sense. And if we just point at things that don't make sense and then say, look, they don't make sense, let's go believe in other things that also don't make sense, then where does that end? You end up with just a crazy Alice in Wonderland world where nothing needs to make sense. And that's not what I'm doing. And I'm glad that you pointed that out. Rather, I'm saying that the origins of the universe doesn't make sense in precisely the same way that the Trinity doesn't make sense. They're not two separate absurdities. They're actually the same absurdity in different language. And so that's not pivoting from one absurd thing to another absurd thing to another and just multiplying absurdity. Rather, it's sticking with the one absurdity and looking how it reappears in different contexts, whether it's physics, philosophy, or theology. So, yeah, I think that's a helpful distinction.
Yeah, cool. So do you want to go into that argument now? How is it the same paradox that's coming out?
Yeah, okay, this is where it's going to turn very lectury. So I'll try to keep it quick. Basically, there's this world of becoming around us, right? There's this world that changes. It's in time. Buildings rise and fall. Presidents are elected and then deposed and all this type of stuff. Things are changing and becoming new things. This is the realm of becoming, the realm in time and space that changes. And it's this realm of becoming that we need to explain. How did we get here? Why does anything exist here and now at all? How did this world of time and change come to be? And remember that term becoming, because that's the label I'm going to use for this type of thing. We need to explain how becoming came to be. And there's a couple of different options. Becoming can explain itself. Becoming causes becoming, or becoming is created by being, or it's becoming and being together to create all things. Those three kind of options there. And I'll get into why that is the case in a second.
I might have to ask you for some questions, because from an Eastern perspective, this being becoming distinction, I'm not quite sure where to place that. So, like, do you need creation ex nihilo to have this idea of becoming, or like?
I don't know if you need creation ex nihilo.
Because we have this idea that the material energy always existed. Sometimes it's just a little ball, and sometimes it expands into the universe. And the jivas always exist, and sometimes they're here in bodies, sometimes they're in the spiritual world, and sometimes they're sleeping.
I think perhaps the parallels will become apparent as I unveil more of what I'm building to. Does that make sense?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. We can. I can let you give your explanation, and then if there's more, if I'm still not understanding, I'll ask more questions.
So we have this world of becoming, and the first kind of option to explain how it came to be, this world of time and change and becoming, is that it's sort of self-caused. And then you end up in this kind of infinite regression. Well, what caused me? My parents caused me. What caused my parents? Their parents. What caused their parents? Their parents' parents. And it keeps going back. And then you get to what caused the species. And then you get evolution, or whatever your theory is. And then that keeps going. And then eventually you're talking about what caused the planet. And then you're talking about what caused the universe. And so each step is becoming, trying to explain becoming. You're using more things that are in the realm of becoming to try to explain becoming.
Does this tie into like first mover arguments?
It does, for sure.
Okay,
it definitely does.
You need a first mover or an original cause.
Well,
an original cause which is not itself caused.
Yeah, for sure. And so becoming explaining itself always ends up with this infinite regression. What caused it? Well, another cause. Well, what caused that? Another cause. And so if you're talking about things in the realm of becoming, in the realm of time, every cause would need another cause of its existence, and it just keeps going back. And I think that's actually in some ways the atheistic answer. Becoming explains becoming, and there's an infinite regression. And before the Big Bang, what was there? Well, another universe, and another Big Bang, and then another universe, and another Big Bang. And so I think that's actually the tact a lot of atheists would take, is an infinitely existing universe of becoming. My problem with that is that it doesn't make sense, because I don't think infinity makes sense. If I was to say that I would give you a cheeseburger after an infinite period of time had elapsed, would you ever get the cheeseburger?
I sometimes wonder if you wrote that whole book just to put that in there as a punchline, eh?
That is very much something I would do. But if I said I would give you a cheeseburger after an infinite period of time elapsed, would you ever get the cheeseburger?
In the book, the guy did get his cheeseburger.
Well,
was I not? Well, was that a spoiler? Am I ruining the book?
You're ruining the book. Speaking of the book,
you're happy as long as I'm mentioning the book, eh?
Honestly, yeah. The book, MonoThreeism.
Yeah. Did we mention that he wrote a book on this?
Amazon. So, yeah. Anyways, if I was going to, if I asked someone, so if I told someone I was going to give them a cheeseburger after an infinite period of time elapsed, would they ever get the cheeseburger? And I think most people would say, well, no, because infinity would have to elapse first. And infinity is not just a large period of time. No, it's that which is beyond the finite. It's something that you couldn't ever traverse, no matter how long you had. Even if you had billions, trillions of years, you'd still never get to infinity. And the point being that if there has been an infinite temporal series of becoming before this moment in time, here today in 2022, then we never actually would have reached this moment, because infinity would have had to have happened first. And so that's the problem, is because you can't have an infinite be traversed by finite time. And so an infinite regression of becoming explaining itself, where one cause in the realm of becoming explains another cause in the realm of becoming explains another, breaks down logically because it doesn't make sense. And there's other issues with infinity as well.
So I could give some pushback on arguments against infinity, or I could let you give your whole explanation, and if there's time, we'll come back to it.
Should
we come back to it?
Let's come back to it.
Okay.
Because I think the big picture needs to be in place.
Yeah. I don't want to derail your argument by nitpicking you along the way. So
no, I appreciate, and there are nitpicky things. There are a lot of objections.
Well, we could basically have 10 different podcasts on the things we've touched on so far, right?
Yeah, well, and this isn't actually just a sales pitch. This is to reiterate, the subtitle is an absurdly arrogant attempt to answer all the problems of the last 2,000 years in one night at a pub. So I am trying to bring in everything.
Anyone who's done any work in philosophy understands that you've just got to narrow in on things, and there's tons of cans of worms that you open up along the way, but you just kind of put the lids back on and focus on one subject, and that's how you make any progress at all. Whereas Facebook debates with people who are not philosophical, and you touch on these subjects, anytime you mention something, that'll be another thing they want to give you an argument about. It's like, oh, but you didn't reply to this point. It's like, I don't have time to reply essays to every little comment you make. And you end up, and if you did that, you'd end up with every reply would be longer than the last one, and you'd be talking about 20 different subjects by the end of it.
You'd end up with an infinite regression of replies about the rationality of infinity. So basically, I have a series of arguments in the books for why infinity doesn't work, and we can get into that later. But basically, can becoming, the realm of becoming, explain itself? I would argue no, because whenever becoming explains becoming, then you need to explain that becoming, and then you need to explain that becoming, and then you need to explain that becoming, and you end up with an infinite regression of becoming, which I don't think makes sense rationally. So becoming explaining itself doesn't work. That's the first sort of option I look at for how the universe could have come to be. Becoming explaining itself.
Just quickly, because although I disagree about the existence of infinities, because our tradition teaches that time is infinite and so on, I do agree that things have to bottom out somewhere, and we think they bottom out at God. So just a quick caveat.
Well, that's helpful, because that's very much the next option is going to lead to that. If you can't just have becoming explaining becoming in an infinite regression, you need to hit sort of a bottom line, rock bottom, and that would be what I call being itself. And I guess you were just saying you have an equivalent to that, obviously.
So, I think we don't believe in infinite causal chains, but we do believe in infinite time. So everything like resets back to God at some point. Every universe creation cycle comes to an end, and then God starts it off again. So where you believe God started things off, created things, they went for a time, and they'll continue to go endlessly. We believe, at least in the material world where there's mechanistic causes, God starts it off again, but he did it previous to this one. He did it previous to that one, and an infinite chain going backwards, and also it has no end going forwards.
Yeah.
But,
go ahead.
And back on your point, just to give a clear analogy, so it's that you're characterizing the atheistic explanation as saying there's a series of dominoes which are falling over, and we can see, as far back as we can see, the dominoes have been falling over, and we can see no end to when the dominoes will be knocking one another over. But you're giving a logical argument that there's got to be someone who pushed the first domino, whereas the atheist is saying, no, it's just dominoes all the way back. Every domino was pushed by another domino, and there's nothing but dominoes in the chain.
Well, that's helpful. It's great. I give the convoluted, confusing, nonsensical explanation, and you provide the domino. No, but I mean, that is what it is. How far back do the dominoes go? And I say the first option, infinity, doesn't make sense to me. So there has to be a first moment where if you keep going back in time, becoming, explaining, becoming, eventually there's something that isn't becoming, something that isn't in time, something that's outside of time, something that's eternal, and so doesn't need a cause of its existence because it never began to exist. It's outside of time. It isn't becoming, it just is sheer existing being. So whereas becoming is in time, and so everything within becoming needs an explanation for how it came to be, being is outside of time. And so it doesn't need an explanation of what caused it because it never began to exist. It just is. And so if you keep going back in a causal chain of becoming, eventually you end up kind of saying, well, there's rock bottom, and that's being itself. And in a lot of traditions, that's God. Um, and that's kind of the prime mover, first mover, cosmological argument that's been traditionally made. And so, how did the universe come? Well, the second option would say, well, it came from being, an eternal, timeless entity that is being itself, created the world of becoming. Um, and the interesting thing with that is it gets out of the infinite regression because being is not in time. Something within time needs an explanation of how it came to be, but something outside of time never began to exist. It's timeless, it's outside of time. So that's how the cosmological argument and those types of things try to get around saying that God needs a cause of its existence because he's timeless. He doesn't need a cause of its existence. So those are the first two options. We have becoming explaining itself, which is traditionally the atheistic answer. And then we have the infinite regression being stopped by being. So those are the two options, becoming or being, right? Make sense so far?
Sorry, muted. I think I've just figured out a parallel to the Vedic ideas, which is, at least my understanding is this material world is mechanistic. So you'll have lots of explanations which are, I think the word would be etiological. So an etiology is the cause of a disease. They use that in medicine, but I think you can use it philosophically to mean something happened because of a result of a mechanistic chain, as opposed to a teleological explanation would be the mechanistic chain happened because the end result was in mind. It's described that the spiritual world has no time, it's not subject to time. But then I talked to Ryan Mullins about it, and he's like, well, you still have a morning and an afternoon and an evening and a nighttime, so you still have time. You're just saying that there's no, that time behaves, what time does over there is different from what it does here. Here, time is that thing which takes away the life of everything. Everything rusts, is destroyed in some way or other in this material world. Whereas in the spiritual world, there's just an increase in bliss that goes on with time and expansion. Everything's constantly expanding in a positive sense. So I think maybe this idea of becoming ties into this idea of mechanistic causal chains, which one thing's happening as a result of the thing that happened before it, not because an end result is in mind. So I think of the spiritual world as there's no mechanistic causal chains, so we don't run into these logical problems. There's just teleological. There's just minds having intentions, having loving relationships, and they're not constrained by or subject to mechanistic causes which happen to them or upon them or interfere with their plans. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought, that it's not, the spiritual world is not the absence of time, but a time glorified, a time as it was meant to be, time without death or negative stuff, time without withering.
I was just trying to find the parallels to the concepts you were talking about. And this is, I mean, I've heard these Christian ideas lots, but I just thought of that right now. I don't know if it's a good parallel or not.
Well, I think it's an interesting, like, I think we could, the problem with this is we keep having side conversations.
Sorry, yeah, right. Maybe I should stop interrupting you.
Too.
Well, maybe the side conversations help people understand each step you're making in your logical argument.
Well, because everyone at home is having these side rabbit trails as well. So I think it's helpful sometimes to pause at each stage and just sort of get to know the place. So, yeah.
Do you want to carry on to the next step?
Yeah. Because I'm still building to my argument. I haven't quite got there yet. So there's becoming explaining itself. That's an infinite regression. that doesn't make sense, in my opinion. And then you have a more traditional Christian answer, and just theologians in general across the religions have often appealed to this, where being explains the world of becoming. A timeless entity that's outside of time and so doesn't need a cause of its existence explains the world of becoming and time. And that's the classic cosmological argument. So that's option 2 for how the universe got here, being. Um, but this is where I have trouble. I don't understand how a timeless entity could begin to create the universe of time. And that's where I've never understood how theologians get around that. If you get around the infinite regression of becoming by appealing to an entity that's outside of time, that's being itself, how does that entity begin to create the universe of time? Because if that entity begins to do something, that's time, that's temporal language. He's begun to do something. And so he's not timeless, he's becoming again. And I think that's what's interesting, is that in making God being itself, in making God timeless or outside of time, we actually make God impotent to begin to create anything at all, because he's outside of time. He can't begin to create anything. So I don't understand how a timeless God of being, or even, I mean, to get the theological language out there, if you want to use an atheistic equivalent, I don't understand how a timeless cosmos creating machine could create the world, because I don't understand how a timeless being could begin to do something in time. And I think that's where you end up with this sort of contradiction, where you have to say a God of being began to do something. And that's why I think the second option doesn't actually work. The first option led to the irrationality of an infinite regression. The second option of being leads to this contradiction where a timeless entity begins to create the universe. So I would say becoming on its own doesn't work, and being to explain the universe doesn't work either. Both of them are irrational. What you kind of need is a third option, and I'm going to call that both. I'm sticking with the 3 B's: being, becoming, both. And this is another way that people have talked about it, where the God of being, or whatever entity that is being, begins to create the universe. Somehow the timeless can create in time. The unmoved mover is unmoved and yet able to move things. And I would say that if you want to merge those two into the category of both, where you have being and becoming in the entity itself, then okay, but that's going to be a contradiction, because you're having an entity that's outside of time but is able to do things in time. So you're an entity who is both being and becoming at once. And if that option were true, we would have an explanation for how the universe began to exist. An eternal, timeless being began to create the world of becoming because he himself has becoming within him, so he can begin to do things in time, but is also timeless. That would explain how the universe got here. The problem is that would be a contradiction. And so just like the first option with the infinite regression and the second option, there would be something irrational about it. Make sense? And yet, I don't know what other options there are, honestly. Uh, you either have the universe explained by something within time, by something that's outside of time, or something that's both. And all 3 of those break down rationally at some point, in my opinion. And this is where I begin to see the parallel to the Trinity. Um, if we wanted to say the both option, the problem with the universe is that we need to have uh, a being that's outside of time, that's transcendent, eternal, that somehow is also becoming and can begin to create in time. That's the problem with the origins of the universe. We can't make sense of it. But that's actually quite similar to the Christian Trinity. Christians have always believed that there is this eternal, timeless, transcendent Father, I mean, so transcendent that you can't even see him without dying in the Old Testament. And yet they also believe in this son figure who is able to enter into the world of time and becoming, who can incarnate in it, who can take flesh and be born and die. And so Christians have always kind of held this tension of being and becoming in the Trinity itself. There's this sort of eternal being of the Father, this temporal becoming of the Son, and then somehow they're unified as one in the Spirit. Um, and I'm trying to say that the basic contradiction of the Trinity is the same as the origins of the universe. It's how do we relate this eternal being of the Father to this temporal becoming of the Son? And so the inability to explain the one just reappears in the other. And I might not be able to make sense of either, but am I justified in believing in the Trinity? I would say as much as I am justified in believing that anything exists at all. Um, and it makes sense that those two align because for the Christian, we've always believed that the triune God created the universe. So it would make sense that the Trinity and the origins of the universe would parallel in some way because we believe the triune God created the universe. Okay, that was a lot. And obviously, that's meant to be explained over the course of an entire book, not in 10 minutes uh, on YouTube. But that's the basic idea, is that the problem of how being and becoming relate, of time and eternity, how those relate, is basically the same problem as the Christian Trinity. How this temporal Son is one with this eternal Father. So.
Right. So I think us Hare Krishnas would agree with a lot of your criticisms or objections or problems with this idea of being lacking some qualities, as we would characterize it, lacking becoming. I'm still struggling with this language, but we can just say lacking some features. How he could then initiate time and so on. I think we would agree with that because we're of the camp of lumping all the qualities into God, and then you don't have any of these questions of, well, if he lacks this quality, how can he do this? Because all the qualities are there, and then we explained how we answer. Yeah, so you mentioned that how you like the Eastern traditions, how they're all ontological. The problem of evil there is an ontological problem. I kind of touched on that without really explaining as much, and we went over that. Coming back to, yeah, I was having a couple Facebook message exchanges with Tyler McNabb. I should read some of his papers. I'm not sure if you've come across his work.
No, I haven't. Maybe I should have. I don't know.
He does a little bit of interfaith stuff, and he defends a view kind of like David Bentley Hart's view, of a kind of classical theism. I would call it a kind of impersonalism, an idea that God lacks personal features. He does a bit of interfaith stuff and argues that it's the same as what's taught in Vedanta, but he goes to what I understand to be the atheistic version of Vedanta, the impersonalism, the one where God's lacking in personal features. But he said something like, you probably heard it. It's a familiar idea among classical theists that God is not a being among beings, but he's the source of being itself. He described it in another way that because then I asked the question, well, how can a being who lacks certain qualities bring about those qualities? So Prabhupada, he's the Param Guru of the Hare Krishna movement. He gives this argument for God's existence, which you can call it, or for God being personal and having personal features, which we can call in philosophy a construction argument, which is the source needs to have all the qualities of the creation. So I'm a person, therefore God needs to be a person. It's something like how we understand in order to make a piece of furniture, you need to have a carpenter whose knowledge exceeds that which is required to build the furniture. You need to have excess timber, then it goes into the furniture. You need to have tools which are capable of doing more than is required for building the timber. You can't be at the limit of everything. You need excess timber, excess knowledge, excess tooling ability, excess strength. And then you can create a piece of furniture so that the cause is present in the effect. And then people could ask, well, you can combine two elements together and you can get a quality which wasn't there already. But in all of those cases, we can give a complete physical description of how the combination of those particles brings about that effect. So yeah, it seems to me like your argument here would also be an argument against God being impersonal or against certain understandings of classical theism.
Yeah, and I think I definitely, in saying that God is both being and becoming, both the eternal, Father and the Son, I have this sense that everything the classical theist thinks is true of God, what they affirm, that God is transcendent, eternal, timeless, immutable, I affirm all of that. And yet I also affirm all the things that classical theists usually reject, which is that God is relational, personal. I mean, they would kind of try to say that they believe those things, but I don't think they really can make sense of how they believe those things. They would try to reject some of those things. And I mean, a lot of them would come to the point where they would actually say God didn't die on the cross. The human side of Jesus died on the cross, but not the divine side of him. And I'm like, what are you even talking about at that point?
Right, yeah.
Just let God, just let him suffer a little bit. Let him have emotions. Let him go through history with us. Let him and so I that's precisely the tension, the paradox of the Trinity for me, is that everything the classical theist says is true. And yet there's also all this other stuff about God that I think is very much revealed in the Son and Spirit that is also true and held in tension. And that's the mystery for me. And that's one of the reasons I love the Trinity, is because it refuses to surrender that mystery by making it totally comprehensible. If it tried to make sense of it, and to my mind, it would cease to be able to explain all of these different experiences and would just become kind of, yeah. Anyways, getting all over the place, but yeah, for sure.
There was another point about the similarity of, so what but back on the question of there's going to be mystery in any worldview, and the vice or virtue of a worldview can be established at least on one criteria based on if that mystery is placed in an appropriate place. And I explained a bit about Shankaracharya's view, where they place the mystery in the world as a consequence of saying that the foundation of reality, the absolute, is lacking in all qualities. Then it's like, well, where did the qualities come from?
Yeah.
So I've heard someone make an interesting comparison that physicalism or naturalism does something similar, because they want to say all of the qualities that we experience are produced by simple physical particles. So Shankaracharya wants to get from something that is so simple it doesn't even have any qualities, any differentiation, it's oneness devoid of any attributes, and he wants to try to explain from that all the diversity of experience that we have. And the naturalists, they want to get from simple physical particles and then from there explain all the diversity of qualitative experiences that we all have. And I think philosophically you run into the same problem. Of course, this is tackled in modern discourses with the hard problem of consciousness. How do we get qualia? How do we get subjective, unified, qualitative experience from physical particles? Which is a whole another discussion. Seems like the word "nother" has become a word. I like catch myself saying it. A whole nother discussion. It's like, that's not a word. It's a whole other discussion. But everyone does it. It's like, all right, I guess it's just a word now. What do you think? You're an academic. I'm just an electrician.
Yeah. I think I don't have a very high view of grammar.
Okay, all right.
I mean, I think you need to learn the rules in order to break them.
Yeah,
sort of like let the rules break you, in order to then learn how to break them. But anyways, gosh, you were talking about everyone's trying to start with something simple to get to something complex.
The atheists, the Mayavadis, and the classical theists are doing it. Mayavadis means Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah. And I think very much what I'm presenting here isn't simple or one that needs to then explain how we get many. It's the one and many being both equally grounded ontologically, so that we don't have to explain how the one gave birth to the many. The many already exists. God is one and three, one and many in his very ontological nature, always. So manyness, otherness, difference, individuality, diversity, these aren't aberrations or later inventions. These are grounded ontologically in God himself, in what I'm proposing. And that's the tension that I think the Trinity really gets at, is one and three, one and many, unity in diversity, where neither dilutes the other. The oneness doesn't negate the threeness doesn't negate the oneness. That's the tension, that's the mystery. So
yeah, so
that's what I would propose anyway.
That sounds exactly like what we understand of Achincha Beta Beta Tattva. I like how you just called it both. If you wanted to add the philosophical argument that given by Sri Chaitanya of inconceivable, then I'm not sure what the English word would be. That mysterious both. What would you call it? The inconceivable both.
Yeah. Well, I'm not opposed to parallels here with other. I mean,
yeah.
I think be very interesting.
Just a little bit on philosophical theism and interfaith dialogue, that we can agree on a philosophical view and on the philosophical motivations for that view, while having completely different things that we insert at the other end of that view. So you've got the Trinity, and we've got Vishnu Tattva, Jiva Tattva, and so on. Well, I guess Vishnu Tattva would strictly be the closest you'd come to. Where you have the Trinity, we have Vishnu Tattva, so to say. But we could talk about all sorts of reasons, because largely the difference of why you have the Trinity, at least in terms of the philosophical arguments that we're discussing at the moment, and we have Vishnu Tattva, could just be revelation. You accept the Bible, and I accept the Bhagavatam. Of course, we could go into other philosophical arguments, and maybe we can parse out other reasons and start to have some disagreement. But I just sort of give some explanation for people who maybe, because people watch these discussions like, why didn't you push back on this point? It's like, because we were having a different conversation.
Yeah, no, for sure. I'm sure you get criticisms from 100 different directions. So.
Oh, it's not that bad, but you do get the odd one. Like I had this discussion with Matt Dillahunty, and I was just trying to at least present the Hare Krishna views a little bit, and people were like, but there were like 5 different arguments you could have given to that one point he made here, and it's like, yeah, and I had those 5 arguments in my head, and every time he said one thing, I had 5 arguments in my head for that one thing, and I could only reply with one thing, and then he'd reply with another 5 things. Yeah. So yeah, that was just a little digression. Do you have any comments on that?
No, I think it's helpful. And I appreciate you bringing up all these parallels. And I think they are very interesting. I mean, when you're talking about ontology, hopefully, if we're talking about the same universe, different thinkers from different areas would maybe not come to the same conclusions all the time, but be playing with similar tools and be answering and asking similar questions. And it does sound like that's happening. So
yeah, I mean, it can be hard to see the parallel sometimes. I do think there are some debates that aren't necessarily parallel. Like, I finally got a good explanation why Eastern traditions never worried about the problem of evil. Of course, Dr. Ravi Gupta was explaining how it's actually ontological in the Indian traditions. How is it that if God is responsible in some way for the existence of reality, that he's not in some way muddied by that? Or how can he be all good and have good qualities? That's qualitative. How does God how can God only have good qualities and only be great if he's somehow tied in ontologically to the existence of this world, and this world has bad qualities? And then there's various explanations given that. Whereas in the Western traditions, it was a behavioral problem. Why isn't God acting properly? Why is he allowing good things to happen to bad people? And why doesn't he prevent it? Why doesn't he step in?
Yeah. So are you saying in an Eastern context, it's how could he ontologically uphold and sustain this? And in a Western context, it's how could he not interrupt creation to prevent this happening?
Well, and the reason, perhaps I'll get into the reason why it doesn't come up in the Eastern tradition as the problem of evil, but just as ontology. That I heard Dr. Howard Resnick explain this to me, that I think it was him, that in the Eastern traditions there was just this inherent understanding of personal responsibility, that I've lived before, I've lived past lives, I've carried out actions in that past life, and currently I'm suffering the misdeeds of my past actions. And of course, this whole debate, you can get into that. Me and Chaitanya Charan discussed this a fair bit in our last podcast. So there was just the simple point I'm making here is this idea of personal responsibility. So there's no such thing as good things happening to bad people. Those, I probably will have to give the disclaimers. Those people who bad things are happening to now, they've done something in a past life, and this is not victim blaming, and this is not something you say to somebody at a time when they're suffering, and because this is an understanding for me. So I am responsible for my past actions, and when bad things happen to me, I take responsibility for it. And then when I look at other people, the question is dharma. I have duties in this world. There's certain religious principles that apply universally, but based on who I am in this life, my role in society, my relationship to these people, I have duties that I'm duty bound to care for these people, and so on. Therefore, it's not interesting to me whether they deserve it or not. What's interesting to me is what am I responsible for, and what way can I prevent the suffering of these other people. So it doesn't lead to a kind of callousness, and it's not victim blaming. But back on the ontology, did that help clarify things?
No, I mean, it's very interesting that in the Eastern context, if you are suffering, there's not this sense that it's unjust. How could God let this happen? Because it is justly me paying for what I did wrong in a previous life. And so that's a very powerful explanation of that. So no, that's a helpful explanation.
Yeah. So and then in the Eastern tradition, the debate was ontology. So the way I understand it is it's like if God is like, we have this idea of oneness and difference. So if God is in a sense one with this world, then this world has bad qualities, and how is God not also those bad qualities, and therefore not great? How is this not a stain on the ontological greatness of God? And then we give that explanation of the reflection, perverted reflection. Yeah. It has bad qualities which the original lacks.
Yeah, and I was trying to parallel that to, there's a similar explanation in where we refer to evil as a privation. Which means it's an absence of something. Like I was saying with light. Darkness isn't something ontologically. It's just the absence of light. And so in our context, we would also say, even though we don't say that, God is one with the universe necessarily, we do, how is God's being sustaining the universe if the universe is evil? Well, because the being of the universe isn't evil. There is no thing called evil. There's just the absence of the good. And that's where God's being is not. That's where things don't have an ontology rather than having an ontology of evil. And so take, for example, Hitler. Let's always run to Hitler. We would say Hitler isn't the presence of this force called evil. Hitler is actually the presence of a number of good things, such as intelligence, German efficiency, but lacking compassion. And so the things that actually exist in that context ontologically are good, because being is an inherent good derived from the one who is being and goodness itself. But it's the absence of other aspects of God, compassion, these types of things, that made what happened in Nazi Germany what it was. And so it's not the presence of something evil, it's the absence of some part of God's good being in those contexts. So
Yeah, I think we have a slightly different understanding, or maybe majorly different. That it's not so much the absence of God, but this material world was set up as a place for rebellious conditioned souls to come, and the suffering that we encounter here is intended to rectify our bad mentality. So this idea that it's an absence of God, it might result in this idea that there's a such thing as gratuitous suffering. That the suffering's there, there's no benefit, no reason for it. It's just we've made bad choices and here we are suffering. But we have this idea that the suffering is, it's like, you know, the logical problem of evil. All you have to do to solve it is show that God could create a greater evil by not allowing the amount of evil that is present in this world. So to get away from the word evil, which can have ontological or philosophical implications, which I don't necessarily want to invoke here, just this, there's suffering, but it's the minimum amount of suffering necessary to bring about an ultimate good. Or one way to describe it is that this world is full of tragedies, and that's obviously not great. But the real tragedy is that we've forgotten our eternal loving relationship with God, and we're here suffering in the material world, trying to enjoy separate from God. And a greater tragedy than we have currently with this series of tragedies, which ultimately lead to us rectifying our bad consciousness, developing pure love of God, and returning to the spiritual world. A greater tragedy would be if we just lived in a kind of Pleasantville where we weren't reminded about this fact, and we could just forget God eternally, and we never actually returned to the spiritual world. That would be far worse, even if temporarily it would be nicer because we could just live in a kind of Pleasantville.
Well, I think that's a helpful distinction there, because I think, in contrast, the Christian view of this world is very much one that is inherently good. It's not a place that we've been sent for a time to figure things out and then return to our true home. I think that in the Genesis narrative, God created the universe and said it is good. And what perverts it isn't that it's not in itself good, it's that humans have free will and choose to do things that pervert it. But the actual world that we're in is not like a temporary fleeting thing. And even with eschatology and Christian eschatology, where, you know, the world ends, it's the world resurrecting and a new earth. So it's almost not the negation of the here and now, but the redemption of it. So that's some interesting parallels, but also some interesting divergences in our thought there.
Yeah, that's a big difference. I mean, I think all Hare Krishnas will find that idea incredibly odd, that this world, this place where it's basically, you know, this is the place, the one word place, name for this world in Sanskrit is Mrityu Loka, the place of death. Everything here dies. Yeah.
Well, and we'd obviously agree with that to a point, because we believe free will has perverted this place, and so it's not as it's meant to be.
Yeah, so we can agree philosophically that this world in its current state is not great, and the spiritual world, whether it's the world transformed or another place, we can agree on what the qualities of that place might be. But like, how does your idea differ from the Mormon idea, which is kind of a Hare Krishna trope of, or maybe it's a Christian trope too, of like this crazy idea that grandma's still going to be grandma, she'll still be old, and the spirit, like, everyone's going to be resurrected, and their bodies they'll all climb out of the graves in the same body, and which is like, that's super weird. Maybe you agree that that's weird, and you have another idea.
My general sense is that I don't know, and I don't want to specify what it will look like or how it'll happen, because I think anyone who claims to know the details of that gets a little silly.
Right, yeah.
I think what my position comes down to is a sense that I think it comes back to, in our view, God created the world and called it good. This wasn't this world, the here and now, isn't just, it has something of inherent value to it, and it's flawed because of the choices we've made, and it's broken, but it will be redeemed and renewed. And I think the resurrection of the body is the perfect parallel here. Jesus dies just as this world in its present form needs to die, or something about it needs to cease in order to be reborn, resurrected anew. And I think that's the basic parallel for the Christian, is that just as Jesus resurrected and had a physical resurrected body, creation itself will be resurrected in the end times and be what it was meant to be in the beginning. And that's when the ideal and the real will unite. We freely chose to separate those things, and so the real is no longer ideal, because we're not manifesting the ideal here and now on earth. But in the end times, the real, the material, the physical, the created, will be united with the ideal world as it's meant to be, and heaven will come down to earth, and those two will be one. And I think a lot of that just comes down to a sense that, while we think the world here and now is not as it should be, we don't wish to just negate the here and now and just toss it aside. It has to have some value for us. Anyway, sorry, I said a lot. You go ahead.
So we would agree that this world is good. Srila Bhaktisiddhanta, there's a really famous quote from him, at least among Hare Krishna circles. maybe the word famous doesn't fit there. That anyone who thinks this world is in need of reform is himself in need of reform. I'll probably have to give a lot of qualifiers for that statement now. It doesn't mean we shouldn't go and try to stop some amount of suffering in the world, but if we think we're going to create a utopia on earth where well, anytime anyone has ever sincerely attempted to create utopia on earth, they've created the greatest dystopias this world has ever seen. So that's a pretty good defense of that statement. But the basic idea is this world is as it should be, that it's doing its job. It's good. It's just we need to understand it. So if you misunderstand the purpose of this world, then by seeing it as it is, you'll think that there's something bad about it. But if you understand its purpose, then you can understand that everything is as it should be. Jiva souls who come here are having their bad consciousness rectified, and this is a good thing. And the common analogy we give is to a prison. So it's a good thing that prisons exist, even if the reason why prisons exist isn't a good thing. But it's much better to live in countries that have prisons than ones that don't.
Did in your system, is it a free choice in sort of a spiritual world that led to them being sent here to get figured out?
Yeah. So there's actually a book I've been meaning to read on the subject. It's one of the big theological debates we have within Chaitanya Vaishnavism is about the fall of the jiva. Did we start in the tatastha, the marginal region, or the soul's eternal? So that raises questions, but at least the beginning of our journey and sojourn in the material world, it's described that we haven't been in the we've existed eternally, but we haven't been in the material universe eternally. That's a common understanding. Or have we? That maybe that's what the debate is. I've never really focused on these in-house debates because I don't find it that interesting. It doesn't change my understanding of my relationship with God, nor does it change my sadhana, which is my spiritual practice in order to work on that relationship with God. So I don't find the question that interesting. But yeah, so the way Prabhupada described it in a really simple way is we're in the spiritual world and God's the center, enjoying everything. And we thought, I want some of that attention for myself. And that was the beginning of our material desires. And sometimes it's described that Krishna pleaded with us to stay. But we're like, no, I want to go and enjoy. So then this world is created as a place where we can exhaust our material desires, where we can try to have our little apartment where we can be king, have our little 15 minutes of fame, try to enjoy separate from God, try to lord it over the material energy, be a little controller, and ultimately become exhausted of those desires. And it also gives us the opportunity to develop pure love of God. We can come in contact with pure devotees. we can come in contact with knowledge about God, and we can take up spiritual practices and ultimately return to the spiritual world. That's the simple explanation. Maybe I shouldn't have caveated with the internal debate.
No, that's helpful. And I mean, it sounds like the same defense uh, of like the same theodicy would be at work there. I always fall back on free will, and it sounds like
Yeah, free
the
will. Yeah.
spiritual entity would have freely chosen to fall away. This was part of my issue with more monistic Advaita Vedanta type things, and maybe I'm misunderstanding here, is I never understood how entities that weren't distinct from the perfection of the one would fall away. I always have to imagine them as somehow distinct and having their own wills in order to choose to fall away. Otherwise, I can't make sense of why everything's down.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think Advaita Vedanta makes any sense. Like, Hare Krishna on book distribution meets someone who defends this kind of impersonal idea. We're all one. It's like, okay, so why don't you give me your wallet then? If you and me are no different, then that's actually my wallet. And one time, the dude actually gave this devotee his wallet, but he came back later in the day and retrieved his wallet. Or
Yeah.
another funny example is Srila Bhaktisiddhanta. He didn't eat mangoes because of he had a vow not to eat mangoes because of an offense he committed when he was young, and he vowed never to eat mangoes. So I mean for that. And he was traveling on a bus and with some of his disciples, and there was an impersonalist there he was discussing doing. They had some mangoes that people were given, and because he wasn't eating the mangoes, his disciples weren't eating the mangoes, so they were rotting. And this impersonalist was saying everything, it's everything the same. So he's like, so as a rotten mango and a ripe mango the same thing? He said yes. So he convinced the man to eat a rotten mango. And these are the kind of absurdities that are entailed by this idea that everything is non-different from everything else and we're all one. I don't think it makes any sense on any level. And of course, when you get to technical philosophical questions, you're going to not have any sense there either.
Well, and I guess if you just locate the mystery in that, then it's like, well, that's the mystery.
The appearance of the difference between a ripe mango and a rotten mango is just the mystery. We have no explanation for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we all have to appeal to mystery at some point, but I guess there's
not when explaining mango varieties.
Not when explaining mango freshness. Yeah. Yeah, if you need mystery to explain that maybe you've gone too far. But yeah, anyways. So, well, that's interesting. Would you then part of the Christian difference from sort of Greek philosophy was this sense that in Greek thought, creation itself is the fall. Like the material, this is the fall. Like we're falling into the material world because the material itself is not up to the standards of the spiritual. And I mean, this is a traditional Gnostic kind of view of things, whereas the Christian would say, no, creation is not itself a fall away from our spiritual state. Rather, creation is inherently good, inherent dignity, and then we freely choose within creation to fall. Would you say that there's a parallel here in what you believe to sort of a Greek Gnostic view, and that would be a similar distinction between Christianity and Gnosticism and Christianity and what you're postulating? Or have I misunderstood somewhere?
I'm not familiar with those Gnostic ideas, but I could just explain a couple more bits about. So, like you say that this idea that the earth will be restored to a glorious state. I don't see. I mean, I think it would make more sense to say the spiritual world is just there's God there, eternally existing, full of all opulences, loving exchanges with his devotees there, and this sounds like a greater conception of God. So we could have this if we accept the premise that God is the greatest being imaginable, or the classical theists will get annoyed at me for using the word being. But, that than which no greater can be imagined, then I think we can make a case for this idea of an eternal spiritual world where God is always enjoying loving exchanges with his devotees. And then there's the odd rebellious soul who comes to the material world, and so this is the place for those souls. And then when we restore our consciousness, we can go back there. So you couldn't have the rebellious souls in the spiritual world. They wouldn't be happy there, and they would bring down the vibes. So you put all the people who have these problems in the same place, and they can learn through association with one another that these qualities suck. And you can also put pure devotees there, so they can learn from the pure devotees that it's better to love God. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps. The thing that I immediately thought was, I mean, your critique of classical theism was, you know, if there isn't this parallel to our lived experience here and now, you know, if God isn't personal, how can we have this? How can we interact? Where's the bridge between us and the spiritual realm? If there isn't similarity there. And I was wondering if that same question might then be posed to you here, because so much of how I think about God draws from my experience, my embodied experience. And to try to imagine a spiritual world that doesn't have some sort of bridge to the actual material world, I don't know how that would work. And even as I'm trying to picture what the spiritual would be, I'm imagining something visual using my physical material eyes, or I'm imagining the warm embrace of, of hugging another person as some sort of spiritual thing. But that's a fleshly, embodied touch type of thing. And so I guess the same question you would have for the classical theist about the personal nature of God, I would have here about the disembodied nature of the spiritual realm.
So
in light of that we're embodied, and most of what I think of as spiritual has an embodied component. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so I would distance myself from the word disembodied. Embodied in the sense of I'm in a physical body which is different from my soul. I could take birth in any variety of material bodies. But in the spiritual world, I still have a form. And you can't really... there's no physicalist explanation for any kind of qualitative experience. So the five senses, you can't explain those based on physics or neurology. They're features of the soul. Prabhupada gave a nice analogy to a glove. So taking on a material body is like putting on a glove. The glove is shaped like the hand because otherwise it wouldn't fit. The glove has 5 fingers because the hand has 5 fingers. The body has 5 senses because the soul has 5 senses. So we plug into the body with our spiritual senses. And when people have near-death experiences where they can see things outside of the body, they're still able to see and hear. I guess maybe they don't have so much touch, but that's the nature of that type of experience. But in the spiritual world, we still have forms, but the difference is my form in the spiritual world is identical with my soul. It's an expression of my soul, and the senses are instead of being plugged into material body, they're just I don't know if raw would be the word, but yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I think then in many ways we're saying very similar things in different ways, because if you still have all of the fundamental features of the physical world, vision, those types of things, what I think of as the physical world in a spiritual realm, and it's just that in that context our form and our soul are perfectly united, that's quite similar to what I was saying with heaven and earth uniting.
Yeah, the early church fathers just should have read Bhagavatam.
Well,
then they wouldn't have appealed to this future earth being restored. They would have understood about Krishna Loka.
Well, but I think in some ways what I'm saying is that I think the same, I don't know. The other thought I had is that I agree with you that, you know, our experience of the world is not reducible to material explanations. I think there's great arguments about why materialism can't explain the senses, all of that type of stuff. But just because it's not reducible to materialism doesn't mean materialism still isn't needed to some extent. Another way to say that is, I don't think our material bodies are sufficient to explain our lived experience, but I do think they're necessary. And that's the distinction. They're not sufficient to explain it, but they do feel necessary. And that's why it's interesting that even when we imagine near-death experiences, or we have these interactions with the spiritual realm, we're imagining them in ways that are just very, you know, there's still visual components. We're using our empirical senses. There's still bodily elements.
But I'm calling the sensation, the ability to sense, that's a spiritual thing. So another point is every feature of this material world is found in the spiritual world. The difference is here it's a perverted reflection. So anything good about this world ultimately has its origin in the spiritual world, and you find a greater degree of that goodness in the spiritual world than you find here, because the reflection's always lacking some of the good qualities, and it introduces some bad qualities. You know, you can be reflected or distorted or misshapen or destructible. So yeah, we still have everything good about this world. We just have none of the bad.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting parallels and divergences. I think there's part of me, and this might just be my very almost I guess so much of my worldview has been formulated in conversation with atheism, and the atheist sense that the here and now has to matter and not just be a secondary step to another reality. That for me, so much of my very Western view of Christianity has been, how do I find a way to be spiritual without negating the here and now? So that's deeply important to me. And I think you've given a response that's helpful. I'm just trying to figure out, I don't know, it's hard. It's really hard to talk about the world not being all that it should be and yet still mattering. You know, it's a very difficult nuance to draw. And I think we're both trying to draw it in different ways. And I guess it'll be up to our listeners to determine whether or not either of us succeeded.
So do you mean still mattering in the sense of, if this world's where everything's going to be restored, then I better not, you know, bury any rubbish, because that rubbish is going to be here later, or, you know, at least even if it won't be here later, it's a sacred place and I need to look after it. Whereas if I think this world is just a simulation created by God in order to rectify my consciousness, then it's all going to be destroyed and I'll be back in the spiritual world later. So I can just throw rubbish everywhere and it doesn't matter.
I mean, you're kind of touching on the nature of it.
I'm giving a parody of it to make it really obvious what the point is.
Yeah, I mean, they're essential to the Christian view is that you're not going to be able to bring about paradise on earth here and now from within history. That's only something that God can do by interrupting human history. So we would say a Marxist paradise where we're going to bring around a communist equality and everything be good on earth, that is never going to happen. That's an overly realized eschatology where humans, for their own might, are able to bring about paradise. I think the Christian view is this isn't something we'll be able to achieve from within history. We need God to enter in from above and disrupt our history to bring about paradise. And it's precisely because our view of the fall and that the world is fallen that we don't think we'll be able to create paradise on earth, because something is fundamentally flawed with that. It's not ontologically flawed, but we've perverted it for our free choices. So yeah, I think we would equally critique sort of futuristic, humanistic paradise type creations, because we don't think that's going to be possible. And we also believe that this world has to die in the same way that Jesus died in order to be resurrected. So it's not that this world as it is will just continue, and if you litter, that litter will be a part of eternity. No, the litter, like everything that's wrong with the world, will be cleansed and made right. But that is still a continuation of the here and now. And so this isn't a siloed off place where God puts bad people so they can figure things out and then return home. No, this is home, and the project is to clean home up. You know, like, um, and I can't help but thinking that is taking the here and now more seriously than a view that we're to leave the material for the spiritual realm. Not to say that that view can't also find importance here and now, but I don't know if it can have as significant of an importance. Does that make sense? And maybe
Yeah.
from your perspective, that importance just doesn't matter. Like, yeah, this world doesn't matter in an eternal sense, and you can just sort of concede that and move on. I don't know, but sorry, I'll let you speak now.
Yeah, so I guess there's two questions. One is is our view guilty of, is it susceptible to the objection you're posing? And the other question is, would it even matter if it were? Perhaps we are susceptible to that objection, but that objection is just like calling, I was going to say the pot calling the kettle black, but you know, just calling something what it is. It's like, yeah, of course, that's what it is. That's what it does.
Yeah.
So it might be a mixture of the two, because we can. One time, someone was asking, Allen Ginsberg, a famous poet of the time, was asking Prabhupada about. So we worship God in deity form. We have little murtis, and we worship those as God. We dress them, offer them food, and Allen Ginsberg was asking, how can it be that God appears in a physical form? And Prabhupada replied saying, and matter and something material. And Prabhupada replied saying, there is no matter. Everything's Krishna's energy. But of course, we do have differences. There's Krishna's energy which behaves in this way, and Krishna's energy which behaves in different ways. So ultimately, when we come to a very elevated spiritual platform, we can see Krishna, we can see God in everything. So it does become sacred. So like that quote from the Bible where I think it was Jesus saying, anything you've done to the least among men, you've done to me. And so we can understand like that God is present in his creation, and we can serve God by carrying out our duties in this world. So I can raise my children nicely thinking I'm serving God in this way, and I can avoid putting rubbish on the ground and keep things clean and try to look after the environment and think this is a way in which I'm serving God, because this is God's energy. It's sacred.
So, yeah, I like that. My follow-up question is, if this is part of God, then does it not in some sense have to be connected ontologically in some way? I'm trying to articulate this. Your sort of final vision of return to God, wouldn't it also include all of this stuff, because that stuff is also God?
So like one time Prabhupada he was in Calcutta during bombing, and he was thinking while sitting there eating during the bombing, I guess he wasn't that scared, that this is also Krishna's energy, but this form of Krishna is not so lovable. So although it is Krishna, it's still a different form of Krishna. There's different kinds of spiritual energy. God has different forms, and ultimately we want to have a deep, meaningful, loving relationship with God, and that's not possible with the material energy. With God's material energy, we need the spiritual energy to really enter into that deep, loving relationship.
So is there part of God that isn't, I mean, I'm going to say good, and then you'll probably say,
yeah, so these questions come up in the tradition of if God is, if this is God's energy, then, and we see the material energy is responsible for so many bad things, or it seems to have so many bad qualities, like, you know, there's horrible poisons, there's venomous snakes, there's all sorts of things. And how does that not, is that not a stain on God's greatness? Is that the question?
Well, I mean, I'm not bringing up those types of things. It's just you yourself said there's part of God's energy that isn't the spiritual energy we want to move towards. And I'm just wondering, what is that?
So, well, that's this material energy. So there's the Sanskrit is the Antaranga Shakti and the Bahiranga Shakti, the internal potency and the external potency. There's also Mahamaya and Yoga Maya. Maya in this context means covering. So Yoga Maya is the spiritual covering, which is what enables God to forget that he's God so he can enter into the loving relationships fully. And it's what enables us, even the pure devotees who are in God's pastimes, can forget that he's God and just be absorbed in love of him. So the gopis, the greatest lovers of God, they don't love God because he's God. They just love him. They've forgotten that he's God. Of course, if you scratch under the surface at all, and there's certain pastimes where that happens, you'll find this deep philosophical understanding of God's ontological position. But at the surface level, they're just fully observed and loving God, and they've forgotten all that. So that's the Yoga Maya. And the Mahamaya, when you're under a material illusion, you get covered, and you forget your material identity. You forget the nature of reality of God's existence, and you just try to enjoy the material energy. You try to enjoy physical, carnal pleasures. And also, so when you flip your consciousness and become a pure devotee, then like there's one famous, I guess it's probably a fable of I keep using the word famous. It's something well known among Hare Krishnas. A common fable which is given in Hare Krishna circles, to be more accurate, is that there was a sage going around giving blessings, and he gave blessings to a king, and he told the king, live and don't die, because currently you're enjoying, but you're committing sin, so in your next life you're going to suffer the bad karma as it results from this. And then there's a mendicant, like an ascetic, performing austerities, doing spiritual like yoga practices, and he says, die now, because you've earned yourself so much pious credits, and your next life you're going to enjoy immensely. And then he comes across a great devotee, a pure devotee, someone who's engaged in worshiping and serving God, and he tells this person, live or die, for you it's the same, because here you're serving God, and wherever you go in your next life you'll also be serving God. So there is this understanding that really what we're developing is a state of consciousness. It's not like there's a destination we have to get to. That it's described that if you fully developed your God consciousness in this lifetime, then you could leave your body without even noticing, because you're just fully connected with God, and that connection is not broken at the time of death. So yeah, really, but still, with the pure devotees, they'll take birth here on missionary activities, or to facilitate God. God also appears in the material world as Krishna or Lord Brahma.